In July of 67, the Roman general Vespasian captured Yodfat, and with it the Jewish general Joseph ben Matityahu. Yodfat was the last mountain fortress standing between the Romans and the Galilean heartland. What followed was a series of increasingly desperate sieges in the few cities with enough troops to defend themselves. By the time news of Joseph's capture had reached Jerusalem, Vespasian had already captured the port of Jaffa, and Jewish soldiers had begun to trickle into the capital from the northern front. In November, Joseph's old rival, John of Giscala, had organized a desperate last stand at his eponymous hometown. John may have been a bandit and a huckster, but the atrocities of the later Galilee campaign had changed him somewhat. On November 10th, John appeared over the gates of Giscala, imploring the Romans to cease their attack on the city for Shabbat. For some reason, the Romans agreed, and John used the dark of night to escape from the city with what little remained of his troops, ending the Galilee campaign. As news of Giscala's fall spread, nearly every Jewish soldier who still remained in the north made their way to Jerusalem. By the end of the year, an entire legion's worth of Galileans were in the capital, loitering aimlessly and occasionally robbing the aristocracy for food money. Let's take a look at who was in Jerusalem at the time. Nobody's sure how many Galileans were in the city, but it was probably around 6,000, the vast majority of whom were aligned politically with the Zealots. Most of them were already distrustful of the Jerusalemites before the war, and Joseph ben Matityahu's surrender at Yodfat had only cemented their impression. The pre-existing Jerusalem legion comprised 3,000 parashim, 1,000 royal guards of Adiabene, and 2,000 regular infantry. These were the elite of the Judean army, and were just one of 11 garrisons stationed throughout Old Judea. But they were far less ideologically unified than the Galileans. The Judean provisional government was a motley jumble. It was dominated by the liberal Hillelists, to be sure, but it also included a lot of conservative Sadducees and Essenes who still hoped to reach a peace deal with Emperor Nero. In Zealot eyes, even the Hillelists seemed a little too comfortable with Judea's new status as a republic. So when robbing and sometimes murdering Jerusalemite nobles, the Zealot leader Eleazar ben Simon usually justified this by saying that the provisional government was planning to surrender to Vespasian. That January, desperate to bring an end to the crime wave, the high priest Ananus ben Ananus turned to the one person to whom the Zealots seemed to listen, John of Giscala. After agreeing to discipline the Zealots, John and Ananus walked out into the court of the Gentiles, where the errant Galileans had made camp. But instead, John incited the Zealots to seize control of the temple. With their overwhelming numbers within the complex, they deposed Ananus and spitefully replaced him with Phinehas ben Samuel, the ineligible descendant of a minor priestly family with no formal education. Astonishingly, the Zealots claimed that this had always been the method by which high priests were chosen. Quickly, Ananus and Joseph ben Gurion rallied the citizenry and the local garrison, successfully confining the Zealots to the Temple Mount. However, the Zealot leader Eleazar ben Simon had written to some of the garrisons of Idumea with news that the provisional government had defected. The Idumeans arrived in February, overrunning the city. Upon learning that the Zealots had lied to them, the Idumeans repented and left the city. But the job had been done. Joseph ben Gurion and Ananus ben Ananus were dead. Now confined to the upper city, the great Sanhedrin became convinced that the Zealot takeover would doom the war effort, and possibly the temple itself. At the end of the month, John ben Zakkai, the Av Bet Din and last surviving student of Hillel the Elder, faked his death, smuggled himself out of the city, and met with Vespasian in the city of Yamnia to beg for mercy. This was not a capitulation, but a warning. Echoing Joseph ben Matityahu's prediction that Vespasian would soon become emperor, Rabbi John also predicted that the temple would fall. Thus, he made 3 requests: that Vespasian show mercy to the ruling house of Hillel, that he and his students be allowed to continue their studies in occupied Yamnia, and that the Romans provide medical assistance to his colleague Rabbi Tzadok, who had been fasting since the time of Pontius Pilate, in the belief that doing so would prevent Jerusalem's destruction. Vespasian agreed. The practice of Judaism would continue, with or without a temple. But he refrained from moving against Jerusalem, to the dismay of his son Titus. "Give it time," Vespasian advised. "The Jews will destroy themselves for us." This was a mistake. Remember how the Galileans didn't trust Joseph because he was a Jerusalemite? Well, now the shoe was on the other foot. The Jerusalemites would never take orders from a bunch of Galilean zealots. Vespasian had severely overestimated the strategic importance of Jerusalem, and now he would pay for it. Meet Simon Bar Giora. He's handsome, Jewish, and unstoppable. When the war first broke out, it was Bar Giora who had led the Jews to victory at Beit Horon, but Joseph Ben Gurion had denied him a command position because of his low birth. For the next year, Bar Giora hid out at Masada, but when the Zealots took over the temple and massacred the aristocracy, he decided, entirely on his own, to take over the defense of Judea. Within a month, he had raised an army of 40,000 peasants and taken control over all of southern Judea. While Vespasian took his forces east to invade Perea, Bar Giora recaptured Jaffa and did something that had never happened before in Jewish history. He raised a navy. At the beginning of the war, Jewish pirates had lent their services to fight the Romans, but unusually rough seas eventually grounded their ships on the beaches of what's now Tel Aviv. They didn't have Simon Bar Giora. Somehow, Bar Giora now convinced the entire Jewish maritime industry to form a massive blockade of the entire Roman East, from Alexandria to Antioch. By June of 68, Vespasian had retaken the Judean coastline, including Jaffa, but it didn't matter, because the blockade could simply resupply itself by capturing Roman ships and raiding Roman ports. Eventually, those ships would have to abandon the blockade, but if they could just stop the Egyptian grain supply through the summer, Italy would starve, and Rome would plunge into chaos. What those sailors didn't know was that Rome was already in chaos. Nero's reign as emperor had been a disaster, for reasons totally unrelated to the situation in Judea. Back in 64, 2/3 of Rome had burned down, and Nero appropriated much of the destroyed area to build a massive pleasure palace with an equally massive nude statue of himself. In 65, the emperor narrowly escaped an assassination attempt, which he avenged with an indiscriminate purge of enemies both real and imagined. But the dam finally broke in April 68, when the entire West revolted in support of a general named Sulpicius Galba. The Senate proclaimed Galba emperor, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and Nero committed suicide. If not for the war in Judea, the crisis probably would have ended there. But now it was summer. The Jewish blockade had held, and now Italy was starving, pouring gasoline on the imperial fire. In January 69, Galba was overthrown by a general named Otho, who reigned for just 3 months before being overthrown by another general named Vitellius. By this time, the Jewish navy had collapsed, and Bar Giora was still fighting to consolidate his power in the mountains. This would have been the perfect time for Vespasian to lead another offensive, but instead he did nothing. Vespasian claimed that he couldn't take action without orders from the emperor, and because of the crisis, it was impossible to tell who that actually was. But in reality, Vespasian was waiting for Joseph ben Matityahu's prophecy to come true. Vespasian was easily the most popular general in the Roman army, and with so many allies in high places, and his rivals rapidly destroying each other in the west, he kept faith that it would only be a matter of time before he was elevated to the purple. Meanwhile, Simon Bar Giora now surrounded the Zealots in Jerusalem. In a last-ditch effort to stop him from entering the city, John of Giscala took Bar Giora's wife hostage, threatening to kill her if he entered the walls. It was probably the worst bluff in Jewish history. Bar Giora pointed out to the Zealots that they were surrounded and outnumbered, and that he could just wipe them out if he wanted to. So a power-sharing arrangement was made. The Zealots would recognize Bar Giora as head of the Jewish government, but would also remain independent from Bar Giora's army and continue to defend the Temple Mount. The Jewish factions had reunited, and Vespasian had missed his chance to take Jerusalem. However, Vespasian was not prevented at all from sending out sorties to occupy most of the hinterland north and west of the city. Within days of this countryside campaign, the legions finally proclaimed Vespasian emperor. Before long, the entire Roman East had joined his cause. The Danube legions had invaded Italy on his behalf, overthrowing Vitellius in December. The prophecy fulfilled, Vespasian freed Joseph ben Matityahu and adopted him, giving him the name Flavius Josephus, before leaving for Rome. In Vespasian's stead, Titus took over the war effort, with his father's 3 legions and a reconstituted 12th Fulminata. The siege began that spring. Jewish holidays are not evenly distributed throughout the year. Titus took command in January, after which the next pilgrimage festival was Passover, when, again, a huge segment of Old Judea's population would make their way to the capital to make sacrifices at the temple. By encircling Jerusalem during this holiday, Titus hoped to maximize chaos within the city, pitting the rival factions against each other, while also depriving Simon Bar Giora of outlying peasant militias that could relieve the siege. Josephus would later claim that there were over 1 million civilians in the city at the time, but this is generally accepted to be a laughable exaggeration. The total population of Jerusalem was around 70,000, with perhaps an additional couple 100,000 pilgrims from the surrounding area and 20,000 defenders. Within the city, Eleazar ben Simon's Zealots had attempted a coup against John of Giscala. They never made it beyond the court of the women, and Eleazar was killed, but in the course of their effort, nearly all of the temple's surplus grain had been destroyed, threatening starvation. Ultimately, though, the Romans didn't have enough manpower to completely surround the city. When Agrippa the Great expanded the city's walls in the early 40s, it was widely assumed that he was making a play against Rome, for the exact reason that it could no longer be enveloped by the full force of Roman Egypt and Syria. So food continued coming in from the south. Likewise, while the Romans did destroy the old aqueduct of Hyrcanus I, unlike, say, Yodfat, Jerusalem did have its own water source. In addition to the 4 Roman legions under Titus, the Romans brought a roughly equal number of cavalry, infantry, artillery, and additional local forces, mostly from Nabatea and the Decapolis, but also an Egyptian contingent led by the Jewish alabarch Demetrius Alexander. These forces converged on Jerusalem from the north, east, and west on April 14th. The legions initially camped far from the city walls. Jerusalem was not an isolated urban settlement. It was actually surrounded by small family farms, and the Jewish army had demolished those farms to create obstacles to a Roman advance. This meant that the Jewish forces could march out faster than the Romans could march in, and as the siege began, a Jewish sortie nearly enveloped Titus himself. A surprise upset. It wouldn't be his last. Titus responded by moving the 10th Fretensis from Mount Scopus to the Mount of Olives. The obstacle zone surrounding the city was cleared out by Roman engineers, but again the Jews rode out to attack him as soon as he set up the new camp. Realizing that the Kidron Valley was too steep to mount a serious attack, he again changed his battle plan to focus on the west, overtaking the third wall on May 25th. Once within the city, Titus established a new camp in the Bezeta and attacked the northern entrance to the second wall, only to have a large force trapped within the Tyropion with too little space to retreat, enabling the Jews to repair and retake the wall. Assaulting it again on June 4th, Titus ordered the wall to be torn down in as many places as possible. He'd learned his lesson. The Roman casualties in the first 2 months were unlike anything expected. The Jews had uncovered a seemingly inexhaustible supply of Herodian-era ballista bolts and catapult stones, which they unleashed against the Romans at the Antonia fortress, while sappers undermined the Roman siege ramps there. At the same time, Simon Bar Giora led sorties out to stop the siege at Golgotha. At long last, the Romans withdrew from the west. Their siege equipment was almost totally destroyed, but they were not defeated. At this point, Josephus circled the walls, pleading with his countrymen to surrender now and spare their own lives. Recalling the book of Jeremiah, Josephus proclaimed that if the defenders were in God's favor, they would have found victory without making war. My opinion on this line of reasoning has been clear since the first time I talked about Jeremiah, but Rome was not Babylon. Josephus made clear that Titus would show mercy if they surrendered now, and that the temple would be spared. But one defender, tired of hearing him speak, struck Josephus with a rock, knocking him unconscious. With surrender out of the question, a wall of circumvallation was built, and Jerusalem began to starve. Thousands of civilians who had not already chosen to flee the city were now caught in the Romans' net. Most were crucified, but when it was discovered that some of the citizens had swallowed their gold coins, 2,000 were disemboweled by the Syrian and Nabatean volunteers. Titus again renewed his efforts against the Antonia, but the hollowing out of the earth beneath his siege ramps again collapsed, not only due to John's sappers, but also to pre-existing tunnels built by King Herod. Unfortunately, this meant that the ground itself had become unstable, and the northern face of the Antonia collapsed. Some sources claim that the earth was undermined by a heavy rain, but I find this extremely hard to believe considering it was late July. In the chaos, the Romans steadily forced their way up the ruin, and as the priests sacrificed their last remaining lamb, the temple became a battlefield. The Romans reached the precipice of the inner courts on August 28th, a day known in the Hebrew calendar as the 9th of Av. Although Titus had promised the safety and integrity of the temple to Josephus, in the heat of the battle, Titus saw such an effort as folly. And in a single moment, a lone Roman centurion pitched his torch from atop the wall into the open door of the sanctuary. At the end of the day, the only living souls in the temple were Roman. The treasury had been so totally ransacked that it is said the price of gold in Syria fell 50%. Whatever few holy relics had survived the fire in the sanctuary were looted, including the great menorah. Greeted in the charred space by vast cheers of Imperator, Titus embraced his men, sacrificed a pig on the altar, and ordered the temple destroyed. At this point, John and Simon held a parley with Titus on top of Wilson's Arch, with Josephus acting as translator. It seems that the Jews would have surrendered at this point, but they had sworn an oath not to, which was no small thing. Instead, they asked Titus to be allowed to flee into the wilderness. This was a no-go. Titus reiterated that the people of Jerusalem would be spared only by unconditional surrender. At this, John and Simon resigned themselves to a last stand. What took place next has been compared to the worst of modern urban warfare. While Titus organized a new siege against the Praetorium, Roman forces in the east besieged individual buildings and fought room by room through each apartment. Jewish defenders hid in basements and sewers, often looking for a way out of the city, but ultimately all were found. John and Simon were captured. They and all Jerusalemites still alive were put in chains to be paraded through the streets of Rome. This was the city of Agrippa. This was the city of Herod. This was the city of Alexandra, of the Maccabees, of Ezra and Nehemiah, of David. And on the 26th of September, 70 CE, Jerusalem was dead. But the Jewish war was not over. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gaonim level patrons Lev Cham and Vicky Nelson. If you like this and want to support the channel, you too can become a patron on Patreon, linked in the description below. You can also find links to my sources for this video in the description, as well as a link to my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.